There is a principle hidden at the heart of the universe that the world spends every waking hour trying to refute. It operates quietly, persistently, with the patient certainty of a law that does not require anyone's agreement to remain true. It governs not the behavior of particles or planets, but the movement of grace, the specific, mysterious, deeply personal movement of God toward human souls. The principle is this: God is not attracted to strength, he is attracted to weakness. Not weakness as spiritual excuse, not weakness as resignation, not the manufactured weakness of someone performing helplessness to avoid the demands of love, but the real thing, the weakness that knows itself, the poverty that does not flinch from its own reflection, the smallness that has stopped pretending to be larger than it is and has simply, honestly, opened itself to whatever might come. This is the principle Thérèse of Lisieux called her science. She used the word deliberately. Not spirituality, not philosophy, not intuition, science. A discovered law of the spiritual universe, as reliable as gravity, as universal as light, as operative in your life right now as it was in hers, whether you have recognized it yet or not. Let me ask you something gently. Have you ever noticed that the moments when you felt closest to God were not your strongest moments, but your weakest ones? Not when you were performing well spiritually, but when you had collapsed entirely and had nothing left but need? Not when your virtue was impressive, but when your poverty was undeniable? If so, you have already encountered this science without perhaps knowing its name. You have already experienced what Thérèse spent her entire life articulating, that God moves toward weakness the way water moves toward low ground, not because he pities the weak, not because he rewards inadequacy, but because weakness creates space that strength fills with itself and therefore keeps God out, because poverty of spirit opens a capacity that self-sufficiency permanently closes, because the soul that knows it is small is the only soul that can be filled with something greater than itself. This is not comfortable doctrine. It runs against every instinct the modern world has trained into us. We admire strength. We reward competence. We celebrate those who overcome their limitations rather than those who inhabit them honestly. We tell stories of people who refused to be defined by their weakness, who climbed above their circumstances, who made themselves into something impressive through sheer force of will. And in doing so, we miss the entire logic of grace. We import into our relationship with God the same economy of merit that governs every other relationship we have, where love is earned by performance, where acceptance follows achievement, where the strong attract and the weak are left alone. But God operates in a completely different economy, and Thérèse understood this economy so precisely, lived it so completely, that she could articulate it as a discovered science rather than a hoped-for possibility. Have you ever considered why Jesus was born in a stable rather than a palace? Why he chose fishermen rather than philosophers? Why he said the kingdom belongs to children rather than the accomplished? Why every parable about being found involves something lost, a sheep, a coin, a son, rather than something that remained reliably in place? Why the Beatitudes begin not with the strong or the successful, but with the poor in spirit, the mourning, the meek? These are not incidental details. They are the consistent expression of a single principle operating throughout every revelation of God's character. He is attracted to what the world passes over. He moves toward what the world discards. He fills what the world dismisses as too small, too broken, too insufficient to matter. Thérèse did not invent this principle. She discovered it. And in discovering it, she stopped fighting the reality of her own smallness and began to cooperate with the science she had uncovered, with results so profound that her hidden life in a small convent became one of the most transformative spiritual testimonies in the history of the Church. She called it her little way, but the name is almost misleading because there is nothing little about what she discovered. It is the largest truth the spiritual life contains, compressed into the smallest possible expression. You do not have to be great for God to be great in you. You only have to be genuinely, honestly, undefensively small. Most people who encounter this idea have the same instinctive resistance. They hear it and think, surely this cannot be the whole picture. Surely God must expect some effort, some growth, some accumulation of virtue before he draws near. Surely there must be a threshold of spiritual competence that the soul must reach before this attraction, Thérèse describes, becomes operative. But Thérèse is very precise. There is no threshold. There is no minimum. The attraction she describes is not conditioned on any prior achievement. It operates at the level of pure poverty, the poverty of the soul that has nothing and knows it and does not pretend otherwise. And this poverty is not a stage you pass through on the way to something richer. It is the permanent condition of the creature before its creator, the truth that grace is always pure gift, that God's love is never earned, that what draws his presence toward you is never your accomplishment, but always your need. This is the science of being small, and understanding it, truly understanding it, not as a consoling idea, but as an operative principle that changes how you pray, how you fail, how you receive love, changes everything. Because if God is genuinely attracted to weakness, then your weakness is not a spiritual liability you must overcome before real growth can occur. It is a spiritual asset you must acknowledge before real relationship can begin. Every failure that reveals your poverty is not a setback but an opening. Every moment of discovering again how small you are is not a regression, but a return to exactly the place where grace moves most freely. And the question becomes not how to become strong enough for God to draw near, but how to remain honest enough about your weakness for his attraction to operate without resistance. Let me ask you something honestly. How much of your spiritual life is spent managing the impression of your strength rather than acknowledging the reality of your weakness? How much prayer is performance, seeking to present to God a version of yourself that is more admirable, more consistent, more put together than you actually are? How much of your relationship with God is shaped by the same social logic that governs human relationships, where you lead with your best self and hide what might make you less lovable? This management of impression before God is perhaps the most common and least examined feature of the devout life. It is so natural, so ingrained, that most people practice it without recognition. They approach God with their polished prayers, their examined consciences, their carefully constructed accounts of their spiritual progress, and wonder why God sometimes feels far despite all this effort. But Thérèse would say gently, he is far not because you are not doing enough. He is far because you are doing too much of the wrong thing. You are presenting strength when he is attracted to weakness. You are performing sufficiency when he moves toward need. You are covering the poverty that draws him with a display of spiritual competence that, however sincere, keeps the relationship fundamentally managed rather than genuinely open. The science of being small requires something most people find profoundly difficult: the willingness to be seen by God as you actually are. Not your best moments, not your spiritual highlight reel, but the whole of you, the failure you repeated last Tuesday, the resentment you have carried for 3 years, the prayer you gave up on because it seemed too hard, the fear beneath your faith, the doubt beneath your certainty, the need beneath your apparent self-sufficiency. All of it. Present. Known. Offered not as a confession seeking absolution, but as a reality offering itself to be loved. Because the principle Thérèse discovered is not merely that God forgives weakness. It is that he is attracted to it. He moves toward it. He fills it. He cannot fill what is already full of itself, but the soul that is genuinely empty, genuinely poor, genuinely small, genuinely without pretense, that soul he approaches with a closeness that the self-sufficient soul never experiences, no matter how impressive its spiritual achievements. This is the paradox at the heart of the little way. Not that weakness is beautiful, but that weakness is receptive. Not that small is better than large in some romantic sense, but that small is open, where large is closed. The small soul, like a vessel held upright and empty, can be filled. The large soul, the soul inflated with its own spiritual accomplishments, its own virtue management, its own sense of having climbed sufficiently, is already full. And what is full cannot be filled again with something greater. Have you ever been genuinely full? Not satisfied, full. The uncomfortable fullness of having had too much, of feeling bloated and closed and incapable of receiving anything more. This is the spiritual condition of the soul that has built its relationship with God primarily on its own strength. It has consumed its own spiritual achievements so thoroughly that it has no room left for the thing it most needs: pure gift, pure grace, pure love offered not because it was earned, but simply because God is love and love gives. The science of being small creates the opposite condition. The soul that knows its smallness is perpetually hungry, perpetually open, perpetually receptive to grace, because it has never confused its own efforts with the grace it needs. It has never eaten its own spiritual achievements for nourishment, because it has understood that the only nourishment that actually satisfies comes from outside itself, from the God who is attracted to its need and moves toward it with a generosity that poverty alone can fully receive. Thérèse lived in this receptive poverty. She did not pretend to be advancing when she was failing. She did not present a stronger version of herself to God in prayer. She came as she was, small, often confused, frequently falling, never particularly impressive by the standards of conventional holiness, and she brought all of it directly and without apology to the God she knew was not waiting for her to become presentable. And what she found was not the tolerance she might have expected, the divine patience of a God who accepts our weakness while wishing we would hurry up and overcome it. She found attraction. She found that her smallness drew God near in a way that her strength never had. She found that the more honestly she acknowledged her poverty, the more abundantly grace moved in her life. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the deep interior places where actual transformation occurs. This is the counter-logic of grace. And it is not merely a consoling thought for people who feel spiritually behind, it is the actual mechanics of how God works. It is why Paul could write from prison that he would boast of his weakness, because it was precisely in his weakness that Christ's power was most fully demonstrated. It is why the mystics across centuries have spoken of becoming nothing as the prerequisite for being filled with everything. It is why Thérèse could say, at the end of a life that looked small by any external measure, that she did not regret it, because she had discovered a science that makes smallness not the failure of the spiritual life, but the precise condition of its deepest abundance. Let me ask you something from the heart. What would change about how you pray if you truly believed this? If you genuinely accepted that God is not waiting for you to become stronger before He draws near, but is actually drawn by the weakness you have been trying to hide? If you stopped approaching Him with your spiritual resume and started approaching Him with your actual poverty, not as an experiment, not as a technique, but as the honest, undefended offering of what you actually are to a God whose attraction to weakness is not a compensating mercy, but His deepest nature expressed. This is the invitation of the science of being small. Not to manufacture weakness or cultivate helplessness as a spiritual strategy, but to stop manufacturing strength, to stop covering the poverty that is already there, that God already sees, that He is already moving toward with a love you have been partially blocking by your insistence on appearing sufficient. Because here is what the science ultimately reveals: you are not keeping anything from God by presenting your strength. He sees through it immediately. He knows your weakness better than you do, but your insistence on strength keeps something from you. It keeps you from experiencing the full movement of God toward you, because that movement is triggered not by your performance, but by your need, and you have been managing your need so carefully that the trigger was partially suppressed. Let your need be known. Let your poverty be real. Let your smallness be the honest, unguarded truth of how you stand before God. Not forever striving, not perpetually climbing, just present, small, open, yours hands empty, and your heart available to be filled by the one who has been waiting not for you to grow large, but for you to become small enough to receive what only He can give. Thérèse understood that this science is not a single insight, but a daily practice. Each morning you wake into the same condition, dependent, limited, in need of everything you cannot provide for yourself. And each morning you have a choice about how to relate to that condition. You can fight it. Spend your day managing the impression of your sufficiency, building spiritual achievements to present to God, working to make yourself worthy of the love you need. Or you can inhabit it. Begin the day from the honest place of your smallness. Offer your poverty as the only real thing you have to bring, and trust that this offering is precisely what draws God near. The choice sounds obvious when it is stated this way, but it is not obvious in practice because the entire momentum of your upbringing, your culture, your deepest habits of self-protection push relentlessly toward the first option, toward appearing capable, toward managing your weaknesses, toward presenting a self to God that seems worthy of his attention rather than the self that simply desperately needs it. This is why Thérèse called it a science rather than a discovery, because a science must be practiced, applied, tested against reality. It is not enough to understand the principle intellectually, you must live it. In the specific failure of this afternoon, in the prayer that feels empty this evening, in the relationship that reveals your poverty again tomorrow morning, in the repeated pattern of weakness you have been confessing and repeating for years, which is not evidence that you are beyond help, but evidence that you are precisely where the science operates most powerfully. Have you ever noticed how consistently God meets people in their lowest moments? Not their finest hours, their worst ones. The prodigal son receives the embrace not when he has reformed himself, but the moment he acknowledges his destitution and turns toward home. Peter receives the reinstatement not when he has proven his courage, but in the very scene where his failure is most starkly visible. Mary Magdalene is encountered first at the tomb, weeping, lost, not celebrating. Thomas receives the invitation to touch the wounds in the moment of his doubt, not in a moment of confident faith. These are not exceptions to God's way of working. They are the pattern, the consistent, reliable, scientifically observable pattern of a God whose attraction to weakness is so fundamental to his nature that you can count on it. You can build your spiritual life on it. You can approach him in your worst moments with the confidence that those are precisely the moments he is most fully turned toward you. This is what makes Thérèse's science not just consoling, but transforming, because it changes the valence of failure itself. Failure is no longer the enemy of your spiritual life, but the recurring invitation to the condition in which grace moves most freely. Each fall is not proof that you are too broken to be holy, but evidence that you are small enough to be held. Each discovery of poverty is not a setback, but a repositioning into exactly the place where God's attraction to weakness becomes your lived experience rather than a theological abstraction. But here is where the science demands honesty that the soul often refuses to provide. It requires that you actually know your weakness, not in the abstract. I am a sinner, of course, but specifically, concretely, the particular way pride operates in your life, the specific pattern of fear that shapes your relationships, the exact form that self-sufficiency takes in your prayer, the precise location of your deepest poverty. Because generalized weakness is not what draws God near. Acknowledged, specific, undefended weakness does. The soul that vaguely confesses that it is imperfect is not yet in the science. The soul that sees exactly where it fails, exactly what it lacks, exactly how it has been pretending to be larger than it is, and brings that specific, concrete poverty to God without embellishment or defense, that soul has entered the science. And what it finds there will change everything. Let me ask you something final. Where is your most specific poverty right now? Not the general confession, the actual place. The recurring failure, the persistent weakness, the honest truth about yourself that you would most prefer God not to notice. That is the place, that exact place. That is where the science operates. That is what draws him. Bring it, not as a shameful thing requiring apology before you can be received, but as the offering of a small soul that has finally understood that its poverty is not the problem. It is the point. It is the open space into which God pours himself most freely, most abundantly, most personally. This is the science of being small, not comfortable, not easy, not the spirituality of those who have given up, but the spirituality of those who have finally given in to the truth of their own smallness, the reality of their own need, the radical and revolutionary discovery that the God who made the universe is drawn not to their greatness, but to their need. And in that need, he has been present all along, waiting not for you to grow large enough to be worthy of him, but for you to become small enough to see how close he already is. There is a specific way this science gets tested that most people never anticipate. It is tested not in the dramatic moments of failure or crisis, but in the quiet, unremarkable moments of ordinary days when nothing obviously spiritual is happening, and yet everything interior is being revealed. You are washing dishes and a flash of irritation passes through you at something someone said 3 days ago. You are driving to work, and the old anxiety about whether you are doing enough, being enough, living faithfully enough, settles in like weather. You sit down to pray, and within minutes your mind is already elsewhere, planning, reviewing, worrying, while your lips continue with the words you always say. These moments feel spiritually irrelevant, too small, too ordinary, too far from the elevated terrain of meaningful spiritual experience to matter much, and so you let them pass without notice, or notice them only to feel mild discouragement at how little progress you seem to have made in the interior life despite years of genuine effort. But the science of being small says these are not irrelevant moments. They are the most important ones, because they reveal with clarity that more dramatic moments obscure the precise texture of your actual spiritual state. Not the state you perform in moments of focused prayer, not the state you present to God when you are being intentionally devout, but the baseline state, the default condition, the truth about who you are when no one is watching, including yourself. And the science says, bring it, all of it. The flash of irritation and the background anxiety, and the distracted prayer and the ordinary smallness of a Tuesday afternoon, when you are not a saint, but simply a person trying to get through the day with some remnant of interior life intact. Bring the Tuesday afternoon, bring the irritation, bring the distraction, not as failures requiring confession before you can return to God's good graces, but as the honest contents of the only life you actually have, this one today, with these specific small failures and these recurring weaknesses and this ordinary poverty that is, according to the science Thérèse discovered, precisely what makes you a candidate for extraordinary grace. Because grace does not prefer your Sunday morning self over your Tuesday afternoon self. It does not move toward the version of you that is performing well and withdraw from the version that is simply ordinarily failing. The science operates at every level, in every moment, without discrimination between the moments you consider spiritually significant and the ones you consider too small to matter. This is both the hardest and the most liberating aspect of what Thérèse discovered. Hard because it removes every hiding place. If God is equally attracted to your weakness in every moment, then there is no moment when you are too small, too ordinary, too unremarkable to be a candidate for His presence. And there is also no moment when you can legitimately tell yourself that you will attend to God later, when you are doing better, when the ordinary smallness of your life has been resolved into something more worthy of attention, and liberating for exactly the same reason. Because if there is no hiding place, there is also no excluded place. Every moment, every irritation and anxiety and distracted prayer and ordinary failure is a door. Not a door you must improve yourself to open, but a door that is already open from the other side, toward which God has been moving all along, attracted by exactly the weakness you have been trying to resolve before presenting yourself. Thérèse understood this toward the end of her life with particular clarity. As tuberculosis consumed her body, and spiritual darkness consumed her interior life, she found herself reduced to a poverty so total that even consolation in faith seemed beyond reach. She could not feel God. She could barely pray. The triumphant joy she had experienced earlier in her religious life was gone, replaced by a darkness she described as a wall between her and heaven. By every external and internal measure, she was at her weakest, her most reduced, her most poverty-stricken. The least impressive version of the Thérèse who had entered Carmel with burning desire and confident love. And this is when, she wrote, she felt God nearest. Not when she was strong, when she had nothing, not when her faith was luminous, when it was barely a flicker, not when she could pray with eloquence and feeling, when prayer itself seemed beyond her, and all she could offer was the honest, undefended truth that she was small and lost and entirely dependent on a mercy she could no longer feel, but chose to trust anyway. This final poverty, this trust without feeling, this faith without consolation, this love offered in complete darkness without any evidence of return, this was the fullest expression of the science she had discovered. And it produced in her, in those final months, a peace so deep it confounded the sisters who witnessed it. Not the peace of someone who had resolved their suffering, the peace of someone who had surrendered it, who had brought even the darkness itself to God as the final, most honest offering of a soul that had finally become small enough to have nothing left to hide. This is where the science leads. Not to impressive spiritual achievement, not to visible holiness that others can admire, but to this, the soul that knows its poverty so completely, so honestly, so without defense that even its darkest moments become a kind of offering, that even its weakest faith is still faith, that even its most reduced state is still a state in which God moves and loves and fills what the soul could never fill itself. Have you ever been this reduced? Have you ever found yourself at the end of spiritual resources you thought you had, offering to God nothing but your need because your need was genuinely all you had left? Have you ever prayed without feeling, trusted without certainty, loved without consolation, not as a chosen discipline but as the honest truth of what you could manage in that moment? If you have already lived the science without knowing its name. You have already occupied the exact place Thérèse inhabited, and from which she discovered the principle that God is not attracted to strength, but to weakness, that his love does not flow toward the sufficient, but toward the needy, that the smallest, most poverty-stricken, most apparently unimpressive soul, if it is genuinely honest about its smallness, is the one most fully alive to the movement of grace. And if you have not yet been this reduced, if you still have reserves of spiritual self-sufficiency that keep the science at a comfortable theoretical distance, then the invitation stands, not to manufacture poverty, not to perform weakness, but to begin the slow, honest, profoundly liberating work of seeing yourself more clearly, of noticing where the smallness is already real and simply unacknowledged, of letting the truth of your poverty be present before God, without the management, the defense, the careful presentation of a stronger self than actually exists. Because God already knows. He has always known. The science does not depend on revelation. He sees your poverty more clearly than you do. What the science depends on is your cooperation, your willingness to stop pretending, your decision to let what is small be small, what is weak be weak, what is empty be empty, and then to bring all of it, without apology, to the God who has been attracted to exactly this all along. This is the science of being small, and it is not a consolation prize for those who could not manage to be great. It is the precise, discoverable, universally operative law of how divine love moves toward human souls. The law Thérèse uncovered and lived and died trusting, leaving behind a testimony so simple it sounds foolish, and so profound it has transformed millions. Be small. Be honest about your smallness. Bring it to God without pretense or apology. And discover, not as a theological idea but as a lived, daily, undeniable reality, that he has been moving toward you all along, attracted by exactly what you thought made you least lovable. Your weakness, your poverty, your smallness. These were never obstacles, they were always the invitation,